To search for the soul and immortality is a product of a childish phase of human development. Ashley Montague adds that man's belief in survival after death is probably related to some deep biological craving of the organism. The belief is maintained and strengthened because it contributes to the stability of social groups and other human endeavors. So he says the human society promotes the idea of an afterlife so that people, will keep their nose to the grindstone, and no doubt also the fear of ultimate judgment, a day of judgment, keeps people from getting too far out of line morally. If you kill that person, you're going to have to answer to the Lord for that. And they say, well, this is socially stabilizing. This is why, then, that it's promoted. On the other hand, some of us have never fully reached a conclusion on that issue. Some of us are frightened when we think about death, and I'm a little frightened about it myself, because it's bound to be unpleasant, in the initial phases at least. But I wonder if Comte's right when he says that the belief that the search for the soul and for immortality represents just a stage, a childish stage in the evolution of man. Is that true? Perhaps it is. Perhaps he's right. It's pointed out that our physical body undergoes decay and is reabsorbed into the biosphere. Why then wouldn't our consciousness suffer share the same destiny as our physical selves? It seems reasonable enough. The fact that we don't want to face our own non-being, the fact that we don't like the idea of ceasing to exist, and that we can't clearly imagine what that would be like, doesn't mean it's not true. Just because something's unpleasant, you can't reject it for that reason. If this is the harsh reality, we might as well come to grips with it. To not come to a conclusion on this question would lead to waste and loss no matter which side the error is on. If the real truth is what Comte says, then, along with the afterlife being chucked out, of course, other things would be chucked out as well, wouldn't they? Morality, for instance, also becomes a childish stage in human evolution. Certainly, to the atheist who sees himself ceasing to exist, and that is a definite, unavoidable conclusion. If you're an atheist here tonight, I hope that you've thought about it long enough to realize that there is no afterlife. That how indeed could a non-material soul, a spirit, evolve out of organic matter? No, that would no model can even be suggested for how such a thing could occur. And of course, this is why no atheist does believe in an afterlife. But everyone who believes in an afterlife is involved in some one way or the other in religion, in the idea that a God exists. Sure. You can see that. I'm sure that the dumbest person here can see that just as clear as the nose on the end of my face. If there's going to be an afterlife, there's got to be a God of some kind. God or gods. Perhaps as we sit here tonight, the truth really is that although we would like to live on, that like Santa Claus and like the Easter Bunny and everything else that we wished was so, that this is still one more myth, one more biological urge to continue to exist, a simple manifestation of the will to survive, and that will being so strong that the thought of non-existence is just too threatening to take, and so we construct this other thing. Perhaps that's exactly the way it is. If so, we might as well face up to it. I'm sure that there'll be some alterations in our life the day that we realize that there's no afterlife. One possible alteration might be the end of our life itself. For some of us, we would see at that point no further reason to continue. That's reasonable. Why prolong it? If you're going to reach exactly the same point either way, if you're going to have to live under the daily burden of knowing that you're headed for oblivion, well, one possibility that you could hardly find fault with would be to get it over with. Our consciousness has developed too far. We now all realize that we're going to die, unlike the other animals who have the blessed oblivion of ignorance. You think the dog realizes that he's going to die someday? I doubt it. He sure doesn't worry about it, that's for sure. But we've gone too far for that. A fluke of natural development. We've gotten too smart for our own good, and today find ourselves laboring under the growing certainty that our fate is that of the mosquito. And what would the difference be? What would the difference be? Number of molecules would be different, nothing else. And thus it becomes very plausible for us to end our own life, and for that matter, anyone else who's in our way. I defy anyone to construct a basis for any sort of morality, whatever, on the basis of no afterlife. I defy you to do that. Everyone has attempted to do it, and their arguments are nothing but empty double talk. Anyone with open eyes can see exactly where their arguments fail. Of course, there's no basis really for morality. You could argue the survival of the species, and that we must be moral and we must do right even though our lives are hopeless and meaningless in the end. It's essential that we do right now so that the species can survive. That's the way it was put to me by one of the most brilliant men I've ever talked to. A man who was a PhD in neurophysiology, an expert in evolution, particularly the evolution of human consciousness. And this is his argument, that we have to carry on and love our neighbor because of the survival of the species would be endangered if we began to wantonly kill, and so forth. Well, and this guy was, I have to read, if you've ever talked to somebody who was really brilliant, this one was. But funny thing, there was one thing he hadn't thought about. I said, yeah, well, why do we want to preserve the species? Who cares? Who cares if mankind, do you think the universe is going to be worse off if mankind didn't exist? And even if it was worse off, what difference would that make? Clearly, underlying what he was saying, there was a greater backdrop. There was a backdrop of morality based on the value of human life there behind what he was saying that he didn't even see. And you should have seen the startled look on his face when that thought was thrown up to him. I don't know how he could have gotten to his age and never have raised that question. And he absolutely stammered and said, well, you know, that's the nature of species, is to survive. It's not all of them. Many have not survived. What different are we? Well, that really was a shocking thought to that man. No, there can be no meaning or value. Certainly there can be no morality apart from the notion of an afterlife, and yet we have to realize one thing. Just because the harsh truth of our own extinctionism hurts, and just because it hurts our morality and we can no longer live as a society, still doesn't make it untrue. Does it? That's sort of like reasoning from the bottom line up. Probably when you make out your income tax, you start at the bottom, right? And then you fill the figures back up the other way. That's cheating. Maybe that's what we're doing in our own minds. Well, perhaps. Or is it not that? Is it not that? Perhaps, maybe in fact there is an afterlife. Maybe there is. I think that thought needs to be entertained at least. I'm sure we wouldn't want to come to the question already with our minds made up, right? Any kind of objectivity would insist on some openness on our part here, the willingness to consider the fact that we may be spiritual beings. There could be an afterlife. I wonder if it would ever be possible to know. If it would ever be, well, let me tell you this. If it was possible, that would be the greatest discovery you could ever make. Nothing could equal that in importance. Some decisions, like I say, really are unimportant, like I suppose the color of shirt you wore here tonight. I'm not sure that has any great importance in the overall scheme of things. But compared with this question, everything is unimportant. Because based on how we answer this question, that is going to determine how we spend the next 70 years of our life and eternity after that. Boy, if I go back 15, 16 years, I was an atheist and had the view of Comte there, and was struggling to come to grips and to come to peace with myself in my own mind about the atheistic point of view on the afterlife, namely that there was none. And boy, it's very difficult. I admit that I was unhappy. I admit that I was all screwed up, and in fact contemplating suicide based on that outlook, and I knew what the theistic point of view was and the pantheistic view, and argued against these things, and yet I had to say to myself, even then, even as an atheist, that if there was an afterlife, if there is a spiritual truth, if one of these points of views is correct, it must be Christianity. That was my view even then. Why do I say that? First of all, only Christianity offers us objective confirmation of any kind. You know, if you become a Muslim and you ask yourself, now wait a minute, and you go to the Imam and you say, why should I believe the Quran? Why should I believe that Muhammad was the true prophet of God, of Allah? Why should I believe that? He's going to turn back to you with a frown on his face and say, what kind of question is that to ask? That's an infidel question there. You better take that to the Lord. And so at that point, you're basically being told, you're just going to have to accept this because Muhammad said he was God's prophet. You're just going to have to accept it for that reason. Well, that's not a good enough reason for me. How about you? Is it good enough? He said he was. But when we come to Christianity, we're looking at objective confirmation. We can go to the prophetic scriptures, and we can see, based on a universally known text, that can be attested, and we have copies predating the life of Christ by a couple of 100 years. And we can go into those scrolls, dated scientifically, and see clear, pinpoint predictions of the future, which later came true just exactly that way. Now, to me, the fact that I can go to these scriptures and see that kind of confirmation, not just something which, well, if you read it and force the meaning into it, you can get this. You know, some people ask about, well, what about Nostradamus? You ever read Nostradamus? It's nonsense. You know, it doesn't make any sense at all, the text. And of course, it's the ramblings of a mind that's completely untied to reality, and therefore you can read into it events haphazardly, and this is exactly what is done. I'm telling you, if you think that Nostradamus might be authentic, what you need to do is read him sometime. It'll put to rest, I'd warrant, any thoughts along those lines. But that's not what we're seeing when we see the Old Testament scriptures. We're seeing prediction that is pinpoint, crystal clear. Compare Ezekiel 26 sometime with the predictions about the city of Tyre with the actual history of that city. Absolutely remarkable. Then only Christianity has that confirmation by prophecy. Then again, only Christianity has grace. Whether you're into Judaism or Islam, they believe in the day of judgment. But how will you be judged? On the basis of your works. Either you were good enough to get by and to be taken into heaven, or indeed your evil deeds go on the other side of the scale, and if they're somewhat heavier, hey, sorry man, get out of here. You go to hell. A rough system, no doubt, especially for the one who, when the cutoff line was 5 million sins, the one who committed 5,000,001, and winds up sailing off into hell forever because of that one evil thought he had about his mother. If I had just curbed my imagination a little bit more. Boy, what sort of God is this anyway, that's so arbitrary? Lets this person who's already a sinner in, but this one who's also a sinner, but maybe just a little bit worse, out into oblivion. Well, I'll tell you something. It isn't going to be some stupid kind of thing like that when it comes to the judgment day for the real God that exists. And his standard, according to the Bible, is that either you're like me, meaning you didn't sin, or you're not like me, meaning you did sin. These are the two categories that God is interested in, and I think you'll have to agree it makes a certain sense, even though it's a pretty rough standard. Very demanding God's standards are. And this immediately begins to suggest to me, who came up with these standards of absolute perfection required to go to heaven? Is that something that primitive men made up? I would expect the primitive men to say, well, no, the standard isn't really quite that high. I would expect them to set a mirror up there and look at themselves and say, well, let's see, the standard's right about at this level here. Give or take a few. And that's exactly what we see with all of man-made religion, but not when we come to God's revelation. He says, perfection, that's what I am. Why should I forgive even one sin? James 2, verse 10 says, if you obey the whole law, but you offend in one point, you're guilty of all. 1 point. You've broken the chain. The chain's broken, that's it. We've got a penalty coming, and the Bible is clear, the wages of sin is death. That's where death comes from, and you will suffer not just physical death, spiritual death too. You'll be separated from the Lord. But Christ has come and undergone that separation on our behalf. That's a difference that only Christianity has. Christianity has us presenting ourselves to God and receiving a free gift. A free gift. That's unique. Let me think through now, having gotten to a certain point where I thought, boy, it looks like this might be true. I reached a certain point in my own life where I felt like, well, gee, God, I'm still not sure, but it looks like there's a chance that Christ might be the Savior of the world, and that you're there, and that there's an afterlife. And I told the Lord, I said, if anyone's listening out there, and if that's true, I'll take it. I'm in. Count me in. That was the night that I received Christ into my life. What happened? I rolled over and went to sleep. That's all. That's what happened to me. I did very much get that sense as a process of growth began that I could no longer account for. Heck, I had tried to make those changes in my life before. I couldn't do it. Suddenly, here I was changing in spite of myself. Within weeks, my whole perspective on life had changed. I felt as though I were a new person. And I had the Holy Spirit within. Yes, this is what conversion to Christianity is all about. This is what's available to you here tonight. If you're one of these people who's still in that position where you're wondering, I'm not sure I've resolved this question yet. This is what's available to you, is the spiritual rebirth that Christ mentioned. You ought to call on God tonight. Tell him that you want to be dealt in. And I'm either going to pick that offer up, or I'll have to willfully decide, not right now. Not right now. I'm busy. No, I don't want to hear that. And that's called hardening your heart. When you do that, this is very bad business. How do you know you'll ever get back to this point again? You say, I'm too young. No, it won't get easier. You think it's going to be easier a year from now, 2 years from now. And it doesn't get any easier. When we hear from God, and I'm not talking about those of you who have questions. I think those questions ought to be answered, and there are answers. Ask your questions. Ask your questions. Pursue it. No one would be suggesting tonight that you make a wild decision based on no understanding of what's going on. However, neither would we want to suggest tonight that it's safe for you to close God out and to walk away and say, well, I sense something there, but I sure don't need any of that in my life. I fear that kind of stuff. And the reason we fear it is because we're basically denying God's right to be involved in our lives. We're afraid he's going to screw us over. And nothing could be further from the truth. And therefore, knowing that we are his and having accepted his offer of eternal life on that basis, yes, I think that the first time we fully realize this, we can never be the same again. You ought to call on God tonight. Tell him that you want to be dealt in. That's as far as we'll go tonight.